All right, today we're going to break down a really key clinical trial that looks at the relationship between coffee and atrial fibrillation.
Okay, let's dive into this study. It's called the DECAF trial. And you gotta love that acronym, right? It stands for Does Eliminating Coffee Avoid Fibrillation? This was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, and it tackles a question that comes up constantly in clinical practice. So, here's how we're going to tackle this. We'll start with the big clinical question they were asking, then get into how the study was actually designed, dive into the key research results, which are really interesting, and finally, we'll wrap up with the conclusions and what it all means.
Okay, so first things first, why was this study even necessary? Well, for years, there's been this real debate about coffee and its effect on heart rhythm. This slide really lays out the core conflict here. On one hand, you have the conventional wisdom, the stuff doctors have been telling patients with atrial fibrillation for ages. Avoid coffee, it could be a trigger. But on the other hand, there was this major evidence gap. The previous studies were just observational, so they couldn't actually prove cause and effect. And that sets the stage perfectly for the DECAF trial's main objective: to finally answer this question using a randomized clinical trial, the gold standard for medical evidence.
All right, so how did the researchers actually set this up? Let's take a look at the study's design and methodology.
So here's the flow of the study. They enrolled 200 patients who had persistent AF and were scheduled for a cardioversion. Now, after that procedure was successful, they were randomly split 1-to-1. Half were put in the consumption group, and they were encouraged to drink at least 1 cup of coffee a day. The other half went into the abstinence group, told to avoid all caffeine. Then, everybody was followed for 6 months to see what happened. So who were these patients? Well, they were typically older, with a mean age of 69, and mostly male. Before the study even started, their median coffee intake was about 7 cups a week. So basically 1 cup a day. And one key thing to note, they excluded anyone who'd had a recent AF ablation.
Okay, now we get to the really exciting part, the results. What did the trial actually find? Let's dig into the data.
But before we even look at the outcomes, you have to ask a really important question. Did the people in the study actually do what they were told? I mean, if they didn't stick to their assigned groups, the results are pretty much meaningless, right? And the answer is a resounding yes. Just look at this chart. You can see this huge separation between the groups. The blue boxes, that's the coffee drinkers. They stayed right around 7 cups per week. But the orange boxes, the abstinence group, they dropped their intake to essentially 0. So you had a real sustained difference between the two. Okay, so we know they stuck to the plan. Now let's look at the primary endpoint. This is the main thing the researchers were measuring. How long did it take for atrial fibrillation to come back after that cardioversion? This chart, a Kaplan-Meier curve, is the best way to see what happened over those 6 months. On the vertical axis, you have the percentage of patients whose AFib has returned. And what you should notice right away is that the blue line, the consumption group, is always below the orange abstinence line. That tells you that at any point in time, fewer people in the coffee group had a recurrence. And here's the bottom line. Being in the coffee consumption group was associated with a 39% lower hazard of the arrhythmia coming back compared to the abstinence group. That's a big deal. So let's put some numbers on that. The hazard ratio was 0.61, and with a p-value of 0.01, that's statistically significant. And if you think about it in just raw numbers, by the end of the study, 64% of the abstinence group had a recurrence, but only 47% of the coffee group did. That's a pretty substantial difference. And this wasn't a fluke. The benefit held up. When the researchers looked just at atrial fibrillation recurrence and took out atrial flutter, they got a very similar hazard ratio of 0.62, which was also statistically significant. Okay, so it seems to help prevent recurrence, but you always have to ask the next question. Was it safe? Were there any other problems that came from encouraging people to drink coffee? Well, looking at the data on adverse events, there was really no significant difference at all. You see similar numbers for ER visits and hospitalizations, and importantly, 0 ventricular arrhythmias and 0 deaths in either group. So the takeaway here is that coffee consumption didn't seem to add any cardiovascular risk in this particular group of patients. All right, so we've gone through the design and the results. Let's pull it all together. What does this all mean for doctors and patients? What's the so what here? Well, the study's official conclusion really turns that old conventional wisdom on its head. It states right here that consuming coffee was associated with significantly less recurrence of AFib, not more in this specific group of patients. Now, of course, no study is perfect, and for the sake of scientific rigor, it's absolutely crucial to talk about the limitations, which the authors did very transparently.
So what were they? Well, for one, it was an open-label design, which means everyone knew which group they were in. The sample size of 200 patients is also pretty modest. And you have to remember, these findings are specific to patients right after a cardioversion. And finally, it did rely on people self-reporting how much coffee they drink.
So, with all that in mind, what's the final take-home message? For patients who are like the ones in this trial, regular coffee drinkers with persistent AFib who've just had a successful cardioversion, this evidence really doesn't support telling them to stop drinking coffee. In fact, it suggests that continuing to drink it can be reasonably considered.
So this entire explainer has been based on the DECAF trial. And really, its findings give us the best evidence we have to date on this very common question. It really leaves us in a position where we have to reconsider that long-held advice about the role with coffee in atrial fibrillation.